Beyond the Abyss is the seventh full-length album from Swedish death metal band Wombbath, if you will. And this is a death metal band, of course, and one that's been around for quite a long time. They started out back in 1990. If you consider they were around before for a couple of years under different names, playing covers, you could go back a little bit further in time, but essentially by 1990, they were one of very few bands out of the Sala area. You could check out Disgrace and Tragic Serenade, as I mentioned here. I think that's worth your time if you're interested in early Swedish death metal, especially stuff with a little bit of doom in it. For this band, they were always a little bit brutal. They were kind of getting there with the riffs on the first two, like the first tape and then the 7-inch. They were nothing special. I would say that they didn't necessarily sound like everyone else. They sounded a little bit more like bands that were more focused on the United States style of death metal at the time. So we could think of Hypocrisy, especially maybe the early Edge of Sanity stuff. A little bit of all of that in there, but clearly they were listening to Dismember and whatnot. So the claim to fame from the band, which an album that nobody really cared about at the time, but that was certainly out there in the wild. Internal Caustic Torments was a debut that made good on a lot of the ideas from their first couple of tapes. They'd worked up to a certain standard, but they were fairly slow. They were definitely influenced by United States death metal, and they just didn't sound like everyone else. And that was probably something that most people just weren't into because the riffs weren't that great. There were plenty of bands by 1993 that could really play and were putting together some incredibly sophisticated or avant-garde music at the time, and they were just kind of another band. So I wouldn't say that I would devalue their contribution at the time. I think that the Thrash and Infest Records stable is all pretty interesting, and there's a lot of good history there. It's worth checking out. The band had kind of embarrassed themselves and given up by 1994 by making just a not very good death and roll kind of gothic death metal record under Lavatory. Nobody cared, so they moved on, and they moved on to melodic death metal. The folks behind it moved on to In Thy Dreams, which was a band that featured members of Armageddon and Carnal Forge, and it sounds like it on that first EP and demo. If you're a fan of At the Gates and where they took it before Slaughter of the Soul, check out In Thy Dreams. That is a band you should probably know. It's a good melodeath band. If you're just not a fan of where Wombbath went over time, and you are a fan of melodic death metal, that's kind of a gem that's worth checking out. So the point to make here is there's a lot of cool things that are in Wombbath's history, but most of the time I'm going to focus on what they did before they reformed. And in about 2014, they reformed. They came back as something that they never were. And that's kind of always been my problem with the band. It's one of the reasons why I never took them seriously when they returned, is that they came back with that big, typical Swedish death metal sound with the Boss HM2 pedal fired all the way up and cranked all the way, and it sounded like everything else. Now granted, this was a time where bands like Interment and others had come back with that original sound that they've always had, and it was big impact. It was cool that they came back, and they're putting out these awesome records that were in that style. And so Wombbath kind of worked their way back into that history that they were never really a part of, because their early sound never really sounded like the Dismember style stuff or the Entombed out there. They were something a little bit different. So for them to come back with that sound, it turned me off from their stuff for a long time. I know a lot of people who've been praising them for years, and they really like a lot of their comeback records. So the many that I checked out along the way were just okay. What we get here is another chance at something that is something more their own. It's something that has a lot of care put into it. And so I'll give them that. And what we'll do is we'll cut to a clip here, listen to a little bit of it, and then I'll explain why this is actually one of the best records from this band, if not the best thing they've ever done. So one of the best boons to this band's sound is to introduce other songwriters who have all kind of put a hand into this record to make it much stronger in terms of its diverse expression. And that involves guitarist and violinist Tommen von Wachenfeld, who is a very strong musician in his own right and brings a lot of classical music influence into most everything that he does. That adds about a third of these songs on here in terms of orchestration, a little bit of violin or other accoutrement, and almost progressive level ideas feeding into this sound, which is traditional Swedish death metal in most senses, but not necessarily the stuff that they'd been doing previous. If you're a fan of the Agma album they did, it was like an hour and a half long or whatever it was. It was too much. It was something like 15 songs and it just went on forever. And what they've done is they've taken a lot of those pretty strong ideas from that record and condensed them down into something that is easily digestible and direct to the point in every case. It manages a distinct sound that is spread between an oeuvre that is managed between the three songwriters. So we get a little bit of necroticism, we get a little bit of Edge of Sanity, we get something that I would say is not exactly like Symphony Masses Erytherian, but there are orchestrated pieces on here. There are interesting doom metal drifts on here. Wombbath is doing a lot on this record, and I wasn't expecting myself to like this in the slightest, but I think even Johnny Peterson's songwriting on this record is actually some of the strongest stuff, and I didn't really expect that because I'm not a huge fan of a lot of his other bands in general. I think a lot of really great work went into this, and I think there's a lot more care that went into finding the places they could go with it and just make good songs out of it, make an eventful listen out of it that kept me guessing at every turn. I don't need stimulation every 15 seconds when I listen to a death metal record, but it certainly helps when a band is always on their toes, always quick turning into the next thing, and making sure that every moment counts as you sit down and listen to it. And I think this record really does well to serve like a pretty broad oeuvre of what it was, what it intended. And I felt like they raised the bar just enough for this record to where it stood out and it put on a show. And that's kind of what's most important to me with this style. So it's a little bit all over the place as a result. So it's a moderately high recommendation because it might not be what the typical Wombbath fan is expecting, which is a standard Swedish death metal record. Check it out for yourself. It released on March 14th. And go ahead and read my review, my written review on the website to see what I thought in more depth.